Could I turn now to the security situation in Iraq after the invasion? I see that from the 2nd of July 2003, on your assessment then, that this becomes a major concern of the J.I. See, I've got two questions really, one on the Sunni aspect and one on the Shia. In the assessment on the 3rd of September it states, quite emphatically, Sunni Islamic extremist terrorists see Iraq as the new focus for jihad. So my question is, was there a tipping point at which we had to conclude that we faced a Sunni insurgency as such? When did that come, and what were the critical events that led to that?
Well, there are two themes there in what you are picking up. One is the former regime, the F.R. is, and therefore there's a pure Sunni insurgency, and then the Islamic extremists coming from outside, but not all of it, and the extent to which of course they interplay with each other, but I think it's fair to say that they were seen, correctly probably, all the same as two sort of separate streams that had to be considered with different motivations. From the beginning, the 2nd of July, you're completely correct to say that this, certainly more or less from that moment on, became the major preoccupation of the JIC and of the assessments and the updates and so on that went in.
From the beginning, although we did not anticipate the eventual scale of the violence and the insurgency, we did anticipate what would fuel it in the Sunni officer corps' wider disaffection and fear of Shia dominance and so on. So that theme was registered straight away, and then we tracked it as it grew.
Looking at the assessments now, I think what stands out for me is probably the mid-October assessment, because it was at that point that it was clear to anybody reading these assessments that we were facing a sort of never-ending or apparently never-ending rise in violence, which we could understand, but which we only knew a limited amount about in terms of who individually was responsible for which attacks. So there were lots of statements, I think probably correct statements, about where the attacks were coming from and the kinds of elements that were involved, but of course we didn't always know precisely which group or which individuals were fomenting them. But if we note that whereas in May there were 5 attacks a day against coalition forces, and by October that rose to 30 a day, and that was registered at the time, we were clearly saying this is a really big problem. It was affecting not just the coalition forces, but it was also affecting the NGOs, which I think was brought out in the 15 October assessment. NGOs, the media, the UN and so on. So of course it was undermining deliberately the wider political objectives of the coalition. So that was seen as the tipping point. In retrospect, I think you can probably say that was the tipping point, and then the trend was it got worse. In December it lowered, and then it got worse again after February on the F.R.E. side. On the extremist side, what strikes me now is that although we registered very early on that angle of things, and of course we had flagged it up before the conflict as a worry, and more presciently than we had realized at the time, we flagged up al-Zarqawi's dispositions inside Iraq in the middle of 2002 and in 2003. In the autumn, we were rather focused on Ansar al-Islam, operating out of the Kurdish Autonomous Zone, and moving into the center, and we weren't so focused on Zarqawi and al-Qaeda, if you like, inspired by U.B.L. and so on from outside. It was mentioned, but in a fairly low-key way. There was more emphasis on the F.R.Is, and I'm not sure that we were, in retrospect, judging I's role quite correctly. It was in that context, I would say, the 7 January assessment was very important because that's the first time when we registered in a headline way that Zarqawi was becoming more central, and then of course that became a big theme of the assessment through the first part and beyond of 2004, and indeed there was an explicit assessment on the jihad on the 10th of March.
My last question really, which I suppose will have the same or similar answer, is with regard to the Shia M.N.D. Southeast. The last J.I.C. paper under your chairmanship, I think it's the 30th of June 2004, gives a mixed picture. I'm not a person who knows how really to interpret these things, but if I could just read, I would like your judgment on how far this did in fact constitute flagging this up. The situation in M.N.D. Southeast remains relatively stable. The Shia population is largely compliant. The polling suggests that support for the British at present is waning. Amara is more volatile, with a mixture of violent Shia tribal and criminal elements. The almost daily attacks have reduced recently, but the situation remains fragile. Hardline Shia are likely to continue to conduct attacks in future. So what does that mean in terms of do we have a problem emerging here, and what scale might it be?
I think it's not bad, given the complexities of the situation at the time. Of course, already by that stage there had been the major uprising of the Mahdi army in southern or central South in April, which hadn't really spilled over into M.N.D. Southeast but clearly had potential to do so, and so it was known that the Sadrists very obviously were a big issue. Although judging Saad's particular behavior and particular power or authority was quite a difficult thing to do, and was always a difficult thing to do, and remained a difficult thing to do. What you haven't mentioned, Sir Martin, and I'm not quite sure whether it was clearly flagged up on the 30th of June, but it was certainly there in some of the earlier ones, that there are continual references to the dangers presented by the militias. So the militias, of course, on the one hand, represented a sort of collaborator for British forces and could help you if they were fully on side, and some advice we were receiving from the authorities on the ground was that they were rather useful on side. But the risk clearly was that they would become a major problem if it looked as if the coalition forces weren't effective, and I think that was actually stated in one of the assessments, that that risk was there. So that was also flagged up at that time. The point about polling shows that support is eroding. I remember at the time people said, what do we expect? In March and April 2003, at the time it was said probably we had consent for 6 to 9 months. This was a year later, and we sort of still had it. But everybody had known that it would run out eventually.
Thank you.